What are your night shift horror stories? Story 1 used to work the night shift at a 24-hour Walmart. Customers are nuts enough in the daytime, but they become weird after midnight. Once an elderly guy came in wearing only a jean jacket and fishnet stockings. He came up to my register, leaned in, and asked if we carried anything to get rid of lice. Are those plastic barriers all stores have now to protect cashiers? They need to keep those even after the pandemic ends. I lost count of the times customers got into my personal space to ask about products for fleas, lice, rashes, etc. Story 2 was an orderly in a hospital. Two of us were sitting in the basement office adjacent to the morgue. A guy passed our office, looking at us a little shifty, came back again and asked if we had access to the morgue. We said yes, thinking he was doing a pickup for a funeral home, but that seemed strange given it was around 12 o'clock, 12:30 a.m. Nope, he wanted to pay us to let him in and leave him alone with the bodies for an hour. We escorted him up to security. Apparently, he had tried it in the past, as security knew him. Story 3 worked in a parking garage at the airport, cleaning the top deck and noticed about 100 ravens all over a truck with a tarp over the bed. Took my flashlight expecting something awful. Noticed as I got closer, the smell and the ravens taking turns, going in a hole they had torn open and popping out covered in gunk. Some guy left a broken down beater with a couple of animal carcasses in the back to rot. No heads. Checked the logs and the damn truck had been there since November. And it was April, so everything was just thawing and breaking down. Story 4 worked as an evening manager at a major Hilton property, got a complaint from a bunch of guests about the noise coming from one of the rooms. Turns out, a drunken man was beating the shit out of his wife and had the door barricaded so we couldn't get in. I called the cops, and they had to get into the room using the balcony from the room next door. I'm still traumatized by what I saw when they finally arrested him and got the wife out of the room. She was covered in blood. It was horrifying. Story 5 was walking through the simulation lab for nursing students at the hospital I work at on very little sleep. All the lights were off, and it was my first time working the night shift. Turned a corner and saw what I thought was a person standing behind a lamp that was on. Turns out it was a mannequin holding the pull cord. Really freaked me out, and I was awake after that. Story 6, it was 3 a.m., popular Canadian coffee shop. There is one old baker in the back who rarely interacts with me past a dirty joke or a dirtier ditty from his Navy days. Other than that, I'm alone, not another soul around the area, and I expect it to remain so for at least an hour yet. I'm boxing up the day-olds for the homeless shelter when I swear I see something out of the corner of my eye. It's behind me. I turn, then look down. There's a small child standing there, a native little toddler with a faux hawk staring at me intensely. I'm struck dumb with how absurd the situation is. How did he get behind the counter? I didn't hear the door open or see him come through the counter. I scan the storefront. No one. I yell for the baker in case he has a friend or something visiting that lost their kid. He comes over and, like me, does a double take at the kid and is baffled. Kid starts muttering incoherently. I get him a glass of water and a donut hole, and the baker runs out of the store to do a perimeter of the block. I called the non-emergency line and explained I have a little kid with no parents. I can't get any information from the boy, just mumbles I can't make out. Police arrive. Baker comes back and says that he can't find anyone else in the streets. The guy from the 24/7 corner store said he'll keep an eye out. Police try to speak to the kid and also get nothing but mutterings and half-hearted gestures. They take him away. I saw them again for their morning coffee, and they told me the little guy walked several kilometers from the nearest reservation in the dead of night to my store. He had gotten to his parents' medicine cabinet and just walked out of the house. I'm floored. It must have taken that poor baby hours to get to me. Seeing him behind me like that in the dead of the night still shakes me. Spooked me more than the guy who threw a pot of coffee at me, the woman who tried to stab me with a plastic spoon because I refused to give her a metal one, and the dude who waited around for 4 hours hoping to catch me alone so he could teach me a lesson since I didn't have the flavor of bagel he wanted. Story 7. Warning, medical gross stuff is incoming. I worked in an emergency room. The worst night that comes to mind involves a patient who was bitten by a baby timber rattlesnake. He was bleeding out of every single orifice by the time he got to us. More blood than I'd ever seen before outside of a motorcycle versus 75 miles per hour. Head first to asphalt. I don't remember how many doses of Crofab we gave him, but it was the hospital's entire supply. But trying to get him stabilized, arranging the helicopter transport to a bigger and better equipped facility, all the blood, those weren't the worst parts. The worst part was when the patient lost control of his bowels. I will never ever forget that smell. I spent the entire time standing by the door with a battery-powered fan and a handful of gauze pads saturated with cinnamon oil trying to reduce some of the smell. The doctor occasionally stuck her head out just so I could waft the cinnamon oil in her face. Yes, by some miracle, the patient did end up surviving, and as far as I know, he made a full recovery. But the blood, the smell, and just the shock of it all. Yeah, never underestimate a baby timber rattlesnake. Story 8, I worked in an open quarry mine down in Texas. We had this storm where it rained like a mother for hours and hours. Being night shift, 6:30 p.m., 6:30 a.m. supervisor, I was in charge of 8 Cat 745 haul trucks, 2 Cat 390 excavators, 6 Cat 980 loaders, 2 D8 dozers, and 1 D9 dozer. It was about 2 a.m. when I had 3 haul trucks get stuck in the bottom of the mine, just spinning their tires endlessly. It was horrible. Since we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars of production per shift, I had to get permission to shut the mine down from the superintendent and relay that to the supervisors up in the plant that washes, dries the material, frac sand. They wouldn't shut down because I said so. I called him at least 13 times within an hour to get him to shut the mine down. Since it was 2 a.m., he never answered, which never happened as he always had his phone on. 3 to 4 of us were soaking wet and covered from head to toe in mud to the point where you couldn't even tell we were wearing neon green high-vis safety gear. We got the trucks pulled out of the mine after roughly 3 hours of using a combo of the dozers and loaders and excavators to essentially build a new road from drier materials. The superintendent got in at 6 a.m. for the 6:30 a.m. 6:30 p.m. shift, took one look at the mine and shut it down for the day. Turns out his phone charger came unplugged and his phone died in the middle of the night. Never knew I called. Story 9. Many years ago, I worked at a regional radio station in the middle of nowhere, Australia. I was the overnight operator, keep the overnight playlist running, set up for the morning, did all the manual checks for the next day, and jumped on the desk if anything funky happened. I spent a lot of time sitting in what was essentially a tin shed in the middle of a paddock, with my dog, shoes off, listening to 50s and 60s music, and doing crossword puzzles. Except one night when the roo shooters came through. They spooked the kangaroos in the paddock, and one of them jumped headfirst through our office window, so there's me, barefoot and half asleep, when this 6-tall kangaroo smashes through the glass window. Blood and glass were everywhere. My dog starts chasing the kangaroo, I'm chasing my dog, and the kangaroo bounds around the office, knocking off desks in the dark, bleeding everywhere. I ran and opened the studio bay doors, and my dog chased it outside, where I'm assuming, the poor thing, the kangaroo, was shot. Then I had to call my boss. Story 10. I was once staying late doing some scenic painting in a college campus theater. It was late, pitch black dark outside, and very quiet in the building. A few of us were up on the stage, not really talking, just taking care of business, when suddenly I saw out of the corner of my eye something go very quickly by the open door to the lobby. WTF. Then it went by again and I actually saw what it was. A guy with long hair, wearing pajamas and no socks or shoes. He was tiptoeing in a very exaggerated way, pulling his knees up very high and grinning. WTF. It sounds kind of funny, but it was creepy as hell. We all made eye contact, and one of the other painters was just about to go shut the door when the dude walked right in. He stood there staring at us for a full minute. You could have heard a pin drop. He threw his arms out to the sides dramatically and said, "I am your savior, Jesus Christ." No one responded, and he eventually walked out. I guess he was hoping to get more of a reaction. The door was promptly shut and locked behind him, and security called. They were not impressed. Turns out that he was a patient at some sort of group home nearby and had done this multiple times. I still get creeped out to this day. Story 11. I worked in a residential treatment center for teen girls. One girl with some severe trauma, abuse, came sleepwalking into the room screaming to please untie her while clawing at her wrists. She was begging me to help her because he's torturing me. I sat her down and pulled her bracelets and watch off. She went completely limp, then got up and went back to bed. It freaked me out seeing the raw emotion of her trauma since she was always smiling and relatively calm during the day. Another time I was doing my nightly checks and a guy suddenly walked out from behind the door coming at me. I screamed and threw my flashlight at him. It was a smiley face balloon. Story 12. Used to work the night shift at a middle school. Every night while cleaning out the boys' locker room, I would hear at least one locker slam shut, sometimes more. This creeped me out when I started, but after a couple of months I got used to it. One night, while cleaning one of the girls' locker rooms, I heard a girl scream. I walked out of the locker room, even looked outside the building, and didn't see anybody. Before that, I worked at the high school. I'd randomly hear doors open and close. Nowadays, I work a day shift at another school. About a year ago, I just got to the building to begin my shift. It was still dark out, and I was turning on all the lights. When I walked by the main office, I heard what sounded like someone ransacking the place. Papers being tossed, I heard what sounded like a table or file cabinet being dragged. I remember my first thought was, man, somebody must have lost something important. Then I clicked. It was 6 in the morning and it was either Thanksgiving or Christmas break, meaning there was no school and there shouldn't be anybody in there. Took me a second to work up the courage to go in and check it out. When I did, nobody was there and nothing was out of place. Finally, last month, I got a call from dispatch at 3 a.m. The fire alarm was going off and they needed somebody to go turn it off. As soon as I walk in, I freak out. The alarm is blaring, but what scared me was the strobe light that flashes with the alarm. The building was pitch black except every other second when that strobe lit the halls up. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie where they're looking for the killer. I was half expecting to see someone pop up out of nowhere when the halls lit up. Story 13, not mine, but I used to work at a small hotel, and the manager there told me a terrifying night shift story. It was about midnight when she got a call at the front desk from a man. He said that he's with his 8-year-old daughter who dances competitively and needed advice on what she should wear. She gave him some basic fashion advice. He asked my manager, "What about fishnet leggings? Do you think those are too sexy?" Then proceeds to talk in graphic detail about how he thinks his own daughter has been trying to seduce him for weeks and how he's starting to enjoy seeing her dance in these cute outfits. Meanwhile, my manager is looking through a computer system trying to figure out who this man is so she can call the cops. However, the room he was reportedly in was empty. The man ends up hanging the phone up before she could find out where he was truly calling from. A couple of months later, at around 11 p.m., my manager answered the desk phone. A familiar voice asked her if she could help him pick out an outfit for his daughter's next dance recital. She asked him, "Let me guess you want to know if she should wear fishnet leggings?" The man immediately hangs up the phone. Story 14. Work in the winter for me is plowing and snow removal. It was late and I had been out for over 24 hours at this point. Pulled over into a small cul-de-sac with the nearest house being over a 100 YDs away so I could let the truck stay on so I could stay warm. 6-wheel Mack things loud. As I was nodding off, there was a very loud bang and it felt like someone pulled on my driver's side door handle. Luckily, I always lock my truck doors. I immediately threw on every strobe rear headlight and started looking around, and I saw absolutely nothing. It scared the shit out of me. Needless to say, I never sleep anywhere other than lit parking lots now. Story 15, used to work nights at a Home Depot. There was one time where for a week or so our store stayed open 24 hours. For the most part, this wasn't really a problem. Typically nobody comes shopping for home improvement items at 2 in the morning, except for one couple that came looking for marble countertops at 1:30 in the morning and the woman was wearing a nice dress. I guess there was also that one young lady who came looking for a toilet paper roll holder a little after midnight. I had just gotten off my first break, and she was wearing jorts and one of those white with black belt stereotypical karate outfits. She was oddly specific about which roll holder to get to, but the real story lies within the insulation. It was nearing 3 in the morning, and I and another guy were stocking insulation, as well as fixing the bays and some such maintenance. A bunch of big R30s had fallen in their bay, and while I was sorting through them, a f***ing hand came out of the mess and grabbed my arm. I lost my mind enough for not only the guy I was working with to freak out, but also for my boss, who was across the store, to come check out the commotion. Turns out a homeless drunkard had come into the store at some point, and I can only assume before the night crew showed up, and had made a nest in the insulation where he fell asleep, The dude was in bad shape too, like far gone into whatever inebriation that we had to call the police to remove him. I was always a little more cautious around the insulation for at least the time the store stayed open 24 hours. Story 16, worked at a distress center almost 10 years ago. Was on the 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift, got about 2 phone calls each hour of the shift from the same guy saying that he's tied up in a room, his balls are tied up with leather straps, and his wife is getting banged by 5 giant black guys in the other room. Asked him each time if he's in distress, and he said no every time. Keep telling him if he's not in distress, then he shouldn't be calling, and let him go. I just can't believe he was up from 12:06 a.m. to make those calls. Story 17. I was working the Christmas Eve night shift in my local emergency department. The clock struck 4 a.m. on Christmas morning and the emergency buzzer sounded. A 74-year-old male patient had gone into a sudden cardiac arrest. The buzzer wasn't working properly, so we couldn't locate where exactly in the department it was coming from. Once we finally figured it out, we got in there and I took over chest compressions. A team of anesthetists, nurses, doctors, and 20 minutes later we managed to get him back just long enough for his family to come and say goodbye to him. What a crappy Christmas. Story 18. Many years ago, I briefly had a job that started at 3:30 a.m. The job itself was very boring, but the commute was wild. The world is at its weirdest in the very early morning. Road hazards haven't been called in yet, so one day I pulled off the freeway and discovered that the off-ramp was completely flooded, deep enough that I have no idea how my car didn't stall. But the most interesting discovery was that if law enforcement has to raid a home, they do it around 3 or 4 in the morning because that's the best chance of everyone being peacefully asleep. One day I was nearly at work when I noticed something ahead of me. I slowed down and came up to a massive police blockade, squad cars everywhere and absolutely crawling with heavily armed officers, but all in absolute silence. They silently waved me down a side street, just a creepy, unsettling experience. Story 19. Working third shift security at a condo, and a mother left the bathroom to check on their mac and cheese. Her 2-year-old drowned in the tub. Once the police were done, my boss called me and told me I had to go talk to the family and find out what happened, even though we knew from the police telling us. My daughter was about 2 at the time. It broke my heart to even hear the story from the guy I relieved, and then I had to go ask the family to tell some Duma rent-a-cop about it as well. Story 20. My buddy and I were in the guard shack at an important entry point, like 100% ID checks, can't be expired, gotta double check against a list put out even if the IDs are valid, so if you're not on the list, your ID doesn't mean it. It's around 3 a.m. and we're watching creepy YouTube videos during the time that nobody is coming through. He looks up and shouts, "What the f***?" I look up and scream like a little girl and nearly jump out of my chair. Dollar store, Jason Momoa was just face pressed against the glass, grinning, and once he scared the shit out of us, he laughed and walked in. The dude was as big as Jason Momoa and pretty similar looking. I mean, dollar store version of him. 10 minutes later, after we calmed down, I looked at him and asked, "Wait, did he even show an ID?" No, he did not. LMAO. Story 21. Oh man, I hate recalling this story. I work the night shift at a rehab facility. We have a protected gate with a camera looking down from above and one of those doorbell cameras. In the office, the camera monitor is on one wall and the doorbell monitor is on another. I was doing some paperwork and saw this guy walk past, stop for a few seconds, then slowly turned around, walked back, and stare up at the camera, and he kept staring. The facility is in a rough neighborhood, so I'm fairly used to folks hanging out around the gate and usually ignore it. But the way he was staring was off-putting. Like his eyes and expression were hollow and dead, almost as if he were in deep thought about something horrible. I was pretty sure he was zonked on synthetics. I used the intercom to see if he was okay, but he just kept staring directly at the camera. We have a rule. If it's not hurt or trying to come through the fence, just let it be. No sense in engaging needlessly with somebody potentially hostile or f***ing with the locals. Y'all, he stood there and stared at that camera for 2 hours. That same dead-eyed expression stared right at me. I did a round and came back to find him gone, which only creeped me out more. Story 22. Security officer here posted one night to an old site that apparently was a hospital being turned into a rest home. With no power on site, all I had was my flashlight and laptop to watch movies cause it was a 12-hour watch. The place was massive, and at night, you literally can't see at all. Anyways, the company had put up a temporary security camera that every time it picks up motion, the f***ing thing sends off a loud siren sound for about 30 secs. The first time that thing went off, I went to investigate with the emergency service on speed dial and goosebumps flaring. I couldn't seem to find what was causing it to go off. It then would go off a couple more times into the night. It got to the point where I would just let it do its thing. but every time it went off, it would send shivers down my spine. When we do our handover with the next guard, I would tell him all the time how the siren just goes off at night all the time. I haven't been back in a while, but man, I still think about that place to this day. It scares me. Story 23. This didn't become a horror story until recently, but as a teen, I used to close down the gas station truck stop I worked at, alone. My boss used to pop up out of the shadows as I was closing down the till with the backup lights on. He'd be super calm and act like it wasn't creepy at 11 p.m. when he should be home with his family. He was even at my high school graduation. He and his wife's numbers were still on my phone. Anyhow, he is currently on trial for murdering a prostitute by stabbing her to death back in '94. The cold case is potentially solved via DNA and modern science.